Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Michael Colbert, and this is going to be our cultural counseling presentation. Today is May 14th, today is June 11th, 2025. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about different aspects of my culture, and my culture that I identify as is African American. So we're going to be talking about African American culture. First, we're going to start with communication style. Okay? First, we're going to start with verbal communication style. Okay? Verbal communication often involves expressive and passionate speech, which is generally considered more credible than a neutral tone. So, in other words, African Americans tend to speak loudly and speak boldly, whether it's a confrontational conversation or it's just a regular one. Usually we tend to be pretty loud, or at least very clear and concise. Okay? Black English contains a wide range of both volume and pitch within its acceptable patterns. Expressiveness and compatibility with the speaking situation is what determines whether the pitch and tone are correct. In other words, the tone and the volume match the situation. Okay, it depends on the circumstances of the speech it depends on the circumstances and the person. While loud expressive speech is often more common with my culture, with African American culture, a personal and warm style is the preferred communication method, meaning that we do speak loudly, but you can tell if we're in a good mood, if we're happy to see you, or if we're not in a good mood, based largely on the tone of our voice. In regular conversations, we take turns, and when the speaker is moved to speak, interruptions do happen. However, they usually tend to be metered and controlled. And we've got a couple of examples on here. You'll see a lot of the common parts that we have for our, what we like to call our black speech, or Ebonics, as it's also been known as. A lot of that has actually made it into the mainstream. So you've got woo child, you've got slay, sis, slay. A lot of my friends like to use that one. You've got on fleek, you've got yes, you've got period with a T. So that's pronounced period, not period. Okay? Just kind of giving you a couple of examples there. All right? Next, we're going to talk about some nonverbal communication types. Okay? Nonverbal African American gestures are distinct ways to communicate through thoughts and feelings and not words. Many familiar gestures such as the dap or the fist bump originated from African American culture. Okay? Frequent and large gestures are normative. There are several additional familiar gestures that are primarily used by Black people. The up nod, for example, the up nod lets the other person know that you see them, and you may not be able to talk, or you may not want to talk at that moment, but you see them, you acknowledge them, and you respect them. You can get all that from that one simple little gesture. Okay? The dap, it's a sign of respect, also substitutes for hello, which is largely a fist bump. It's largely a fist bump. Sometimes you're going to have a couple of other things added on to it. Additionally, we do tend to touch our children more. I know I love on my kids a lot. Even though they're older, I still do it, so that's true. I definitely do that. And we tend to touch our children more often, and for greater lengths of time than comparatively European American parents. And African Americans may perceive greater emotional intensity in facial expressions than other cultures. As in, for example, my mom, if I were to say something to my mom and I had a certain look on my face, she would interpret that as me giving her attitude, even if what I'm saying is just the regular words, okay? So our nonverbal communication is frequently used and very important inside of African American culture, okay? Next, we're going to talk about some aspects of African American culture that I personally am proud of. Okay. All right, let's start with, we have a strong cultural identity. So that would be, you can see that demonstrated here. There are several different pictures here just depicting the story of Black people in America. Okay, rich cultural contributions to music, dance, art, literature, cuisine, food, and other areas have become integral parts of the fabric of American culture. So we've made several huge contributions with dance, with music, all kinds of things like that. Okay, motivation and resilience also develop through overcoming adversity. So frequently the struggle, African American struggle, is recanted. It's spoken, not recanted, but spoken often, and we draw strength from that because we know we can get through it. Okay. Motivation and resilience additionally develop through overcoming adversity. Diversity of thought and experiences. So we have a lot of different experiences and a lot of different thoughts that go between our community. The spirit of activism and community organizing. All for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement. That is a big organization where we all get together and they all come campaign for the same cause, or possibly another good example would be those protests that you see out in Los Angeles right now. Okay, that one isn't just African American, but we are definitely a part of that. Okay. Cultural trend settings such as the dap with a fist bump, as I discussed earlier. Emphasis on community and social justice. Again, you will see that a lot in the Black Lives Matter movement and a couple of other things that we're going to discuss here in a little while. Overall resilience and strength as a people. Cultural diversity and enrichment. Increased social and political activism, along with increased representation on both fronts. So there are we're seeing a lot more African American elected officials. We're seeing a lot more of that, okay? Cultural exchange and global influence, and finally, building bridges for fostering and understanding, okay? We are, as a culture, we generally look to understand and happily coexist with others. So we don't really let's just say we don't go looking for confrontation, okay? It somehow manages to find us regardless, but in the event, that's not our primary goal. That's not the primary goal of the African American culture, okay? Now we're going to talk about some things that I would like to see improved within the culture, right? Hey, we do have several negative aspects of African American culture that I would very much like to see improved. Beginning with, we're often on the receiving end of institutional racism and systemic inequality. This very often it can appear, whether it is or not, it very often appears that the system is actively rigged against African American culture. It's designed to keep the culture from advancing, right? We see that a lot, and it is manifested in higher unemployment rates, lower wages, and greater job instability as compared to white Americans, which leads to significant economic disparity. High levels of black-on-black violence, gang and criminal activity in lower income or poverty-stricken areas would often involve violent or deadly encounters, and these did disproportionately affect African Americans. I remember seeing that a lot back in the 90s when the Crips and the Bloods were particularly active in Los Angeles. And I remember there was a few movies that were made depicting that struggle. Probably the most notable one would be Boys in the Hood. You also have Menace to Society as well, okay? We're excessively disposed to having negative encounters with law enforcement officials, which includes violent or even deadly encounters. Aggressive policing and policies within criminal justice system inordinately impact the mental health of African Americans and their communities, right? As you'll see, we've got a couple people over here who were affected by that. Mr. Arbery was not, but these two, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, both of whom had violent encounters with the police. Both of them had violent encounters, and which unfortunately ended up costing them their lives. That is it's a lot more prevalent among the African American culture to have more encounters and more violent encounters with law enforcement officials. And then of course, we also have internalized racism. So those will be negative stereotypes about our own racial group. So yes, within the African American community, there are negative stereotypes, and we will be talking about those in a few moments. Okay, first we're going to talk about the stereotypes towards African American culture. As in, these are stereotypes that are held by other cultures about African American culture. Okay? All right, so first we're going to start with, there is some historical context to this. So we're going to start with the transatlantic slave trade, Dred Scott decision, Jim Crow laws, and other such precedents. There are several, because of these policies and these procedures, we now have the following stereotypes held towards African American culture by other cultures, okay? First off, African Americans are lazy and prefer to avoid work. And considering the amount that I put in to do this, I can definitely tell you that that is not true. African Americans are backwards and poorly educated, if at all, okay? Again, not true, okay? African Americans are lewd and overly sexual. You'll get that a lot from the earlier things. African Americans are dishonest and lie frequently and can't be trusted. Also, African Americans are submissive and predisposed to being slaves, such as the Uncle Tom character created by Harriet Beecher Stowe of the similarly titled novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. The character was very submissive, and he was in constant need of white approval. Constant, okay? Did everything that he could do, even to the detriment of his own people, in order to get the white approval, okay? African Americans are trusted and never to be, are treacherous and are not to be trusted. African Americans are mischievous troublemakers. If you go back and you look at the story, there's a story called Brer Rabbit, and Brer Rabbit was mischievous. Okay, he was a troublemaker. He made problems for all of the other animals in the community, and he was a very strong allegory of an African American. Okay. Other harmful stereotypes that we can see on here, we have the Mandingo, this was based on the muscular African American who was generally a slave, and they're designed to be, they're there to fight. Okay. Here's the Uncle Tom right here. Here you've got blackface, which unfortunately you do still see. That's still around. You've got Jim Crow, the original Jim Crow, the guy that they based the laws off of. The idea was to try to keep, again, systemic. The idea was to try to keep African Americans, this was shortly after slavery, the idea was to keep them as low as possible, as uneducated as possible, as unable to vote as possible. You've got the mammy, and you've got the watermelon. All of those are pervasive negative stereotypes towards African American culture. Next, we're going to talk about stereotypes held within our own culture. So this is stereotypes that African Americans have against themselves. Okay. Internalized racism and colorism. So, yes, internalized racism is a thing inside of African American culture. The way that it works is it tends to favor more light skinned over the darker skinned. So that would be colorism. Okay, so just see up here, you've got colorism issue. Okay. Next, you have the angry black woman. Over on the far left, they're seen as aggressive and domineering. They contribute to internalized pressure to suppress emotions and potentially lead to negative psychological effects. Okay? Black women may feel the need to restrain their emotions to avoid being perceived as an angry Black woman. Views on athleticism versus intelligence. Now, generally, it is largely considered, again, a stereotype that African Americans are better at sports than most people, or better at certain sports, such as basketball or football. But again, they consider that if you are good at sports, then you can't be that smart, because all you do is focus on sports. So again, that's another negative stereotype that is had within our own community. And then the last one would be the Black American princess, shows a materialistic and privileged Black woman who could reinforce class distinctions and suggest that Black women who achieve success are less authentic. So if you have your stuff together, then you're considered to be less than, which is, again, another harmful stereotype within the community, okay? Okay? Next, we're going to talk about how does African American culture perceive substance use? So next we're going to talk about substance use. Okay? Right. Historically, African Americans have faced discrimination. Excuse me. I'm sorry about that. That's not where we are. There we go. While African Americans tend to have lower rates of binge drinking and alcohol dependence compared to other groups, the ones that do struggle with alcohol addiction and may experience more persistent dependence. Drug use is slightly higher among African Americans, mainly due to higher marijuana use. However, use of other illegal drugs is lower than the national average. Okay? Marijuana is a bit higher, but everything else is a bit lower. All right? Generally, whenever an African American has a substance use disorder, it's considered to be an internal family issue. So they don't often go and get help for it. Okay? Traditional uses of the substance in African American culture were often related to healing practices. Okay? Enslaved Africans and enslaved African Americans utilized their knowledge of medicinal plants from both Africa and North America for various purposes, such as licorice root for coughs and fevers, okra leaves for boils and sores, sassafras for cleansing the blood, and cotton root bark by women for reproductive health purposes. Okay? All right, next we're going to talk about African American perception of counseling. Historically, African Americans have faced discrimination and bias in mental health treatment. So it leads to a general distrust of the system itself and its providers, because they're seen as agents of that system and are also not to be trusted. Despite the evident need for mental health counseling, many African Americans are reluctant to seek treatment. Some of the reluctance is rooted in the reality, historically, that African Americans have had their mental health abused and mental health treatment administered with liberal doses of discrimination and bias. Another example, the Tuskegee experiment was back in I believe the 50s and 60s, somewhere in that area. But the Tuskegee experiment has been cited as a kind of a landmark explanation, kind of a primary explanation as to why African Americans in general don't trust government. And as a result, they don't trust anything that is run or controlled by the government, and that to an extent can come into medical treatment and mental health treatment. Okay? We have a strong emphasis on family and community support can lead individuals to seek help from loved ones or spiritual leaders as opposed to going to formal counseling. The church is seen as a place of refuge, healing, and support within the Black community, and often overshadows the need for formal counseling. Okay? Next, I'm going to talk about how I can, as an African American counselor, how I can use my ability to, how I can influence my ability to counsel somebody who is African American. or who is also African American. All right. As an African American counselor, I would have specific cultural advantages in counseling other African Americans. For example, I would have a deeper understanding and empathy with the client because we're a similar background. Chances are we've had similar struggles. We may have not had exact same struggles, but we've had similar struggles. So I'd probably be more open and more understanding to their issues. Okay. That would foster a stronger trust and more empathy within the therapeutic relationship, as you just said. Additionally, seeing a therapist who resembles them can help dispel stereotypes and encourage more people to seek the care they need, right? And while we do have a shared background, which is great, we've also got to be understanding and mindful of potential countertransference, okay? Over-identification with the client's experience can potentially hinder objectivity in the therapeutic process. Additionally, while we share a cultural background, it's crucial to remember that not all individuals within a cultural group share the same experiences or perspectives. Race or ethnicity does not necessarily mean a shared understanding. And I believe that this most closely aligns with the professional dispositions of compassion and respect for the diversity of others. Okay? And finally, we're going to talk about how could an African American cultural background influence my ability to counsel someone from a different culture. All right, thank you. As an African American counselor, personal experiences within the community can offer insights into the impact of cultural norms, values, beliefs on individuals' behavior and mental health. I would also be sensitive to racism and discrimination encountered by other groups, as I've been through it myself, or I would be able to empathize or identify with that. And my awareness of cultural influences can lead to more culturally appropriate and effective counseling practices. And I can use interventions specific to the client that is still respectful and supportive of their culture. Okay? Additionally, acknowledging the impact of systemic inequities on the well-being of marginalized groups can also guide counselors in advocating for access to mental health services and resources. Okay? And similarly, just like the last one, I would believe that this most closely identifies with the professional dispositions of respect for the diversity of others and compassion. All right, well, I want to thank you very much for your time today. I very much appreciate it. And that's all for tonight. Thank you very much.